wonderful crowd. For those of you who are at Wayne State, so glad you're here. For those of you who are coming from outside, welcome to the university. I'm Mark Crewman. I'm chair of the Department of History at Wayne State and director of the Center for the Study of Citizenship, which I'm happy to say is the preeminent global institute for research and promotion of citizenship. The work of the center is predicated upon the belief that vital communities, social, cultural, political, economic, all require knowledgeable, active citizens. In a country where people get to watch the television network that echoes their beliefs, or limit their surfing of the web to those sites that reflect their politics, the Center for the Study of Citizenship provides a civic forum for discussion of issues that divide us in the United States and around the world. At the center, we seek conversations about difficult and potentially divisive issues. Just last week at the center's Citizenship and Constitution Day program, we brought together Republican and Democratic fundraisers and politicians, and despite their vast disagreements, by the end of the evening, they agreed unanimously about the need for transparency in campaign fundraising, a consensus born out of conflict. Speaking of donations, because the center lives on the generosity of its donors, please take a look at the donor card in the center brochure and consider a gift to the center. Commercial is over. Michael Murto, our Director of Development, I'm sure is pleased with me. But on a more serious level, I do want to point out that this is the second time that we have held a debate on same-sex marriage. A little over 6 years ago, the center sponsored its first debate on the subject. And we return to this important issue now because of the seismic cultural shift that seems to have taken place since then. Half a dozen states now have legalized same-sex marriage. 2 more states and the District of Columbia will hold referenda on the subject this November. And the President of the United States has publicly endorsed the legalization of same-sex marriage and ordered the Justice Department not to enforce the Defense of Marriage Act. So now, in 2012, is an appropriate time for us to revisit this important issue. I might add that the 2 best attended programs that the center has sponsored have been its first and now its second debate on same-sex marriage. And I thank you again for being here. With us tonight is the founder of the National Organization for Marriage, Maggie Gallagher, and John Corvino, who has not founded an organization in favor of same-sex marriage, but he is one of that cause's leading spokesmen in the nation. I will confess that John enjoys something of a home court advantage tonight because his day job is as a professor of philosophy and chair of the philosophy department here at Wayne State University. As you will hear this evening, Maggie and John disagree mightily about same-sex marriage, but they agree equally as mightily that this issue must be discussed with civility. Their civil behavior, and I dare say their friendship, has led to the publication of their co-authored book, as you saw outside, appropriately entitled, as you can also see, we've borrowed the poster and the title of this evening from their book, Debating Same-Sex Marriage. John and Maggie will be signing copies after the program. Meanwhile, I want to emphasize that it is imperative that everyone in the audience tonight follow Maggie and John's example. Our watchword for this evening, no matter how passionate your views on this controversial subject are, is civility. You can all see it easily from the back row on my lapel button. It says civility. Okay, maybe you can't see it in the back row. I want to thank sponsors for tonight for helping to make this evening possible. The Office of the Dean of Students has been instrumental in enabling us to bring Maggie here. MGM Grand Detroit took a bet on this debate and co-sponsored the program. And our newly and appropriately renamed Women's Studies program, now Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, headed by its estimable director, Ann Duggan, is a third major co-sponsor. I want to thank them all for making this evening possible. And I'm not here to moderate, just to introduce Maggie Gallagher and John Corvino.
Good evening. I want to thank Mark Crewman and the Center for Citizenship, the Dean of Students Office, the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program. And particularly, I want to thank Maggie, who agreed to come here to my home court, as it were. And I appreciate your being here, and I appreciate all of you being here. Maggie and I have had a number of debates together, and of course we've debated each other in this book. And we decided that we want to make tonight a little bit different in the sense of being more of a conversation and dialogue than a debate, where we could maybe get some clarity on where we differ and why. And one of the things we found in doing this, there's something that we tried in New York a number of months ago. When the book was first released, David Blankenhorn at the Institute for American Values very graciously invited us to go there and do a program. And he invited us to start the program by switching sides and giving each of us 3 minutes to channel the other person's position. And so we're going to start this evening by doing that before each of us gets up and gives about a 15-minute opening statement. Then we'll have a little time to ask each other questions, and then comes our favorite part where we open the floor to questions from you. And there are a lot of you here. Thank you so much for being here. There are microphones on either aisle at the front, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible in the hour and a half or so that we have. But without further ado, John. So what I'd like you to do is, in 3 minutes, you've been an advocate for marriage equality for some time, and what I'd like you to do is, in 3 minutes, sort of state a summary of your best case.
Gay people exist. They form relationships. They fall in love. They are perfectly capable of committing and caretaking, and commitment and caretaking are very good things. It's good for people, the people who do it, because it takes you out of your selfish self. But caretaking, love that includes caretaking is hard, and therefore we have an institution, like an institution called marriage, which exists not only to give people the legal tools that are most helpful in their creating a committed relationship, but also which helps sustain that loving relationship through the good times and the bad times. So gay marriage is good for the people who do it. It's good for society because gay people are part of society. And it doesn't take anything away from anyone else. We have enough marriage to share.
I'm convinced.
By the way, this is a good exercise. You might try this at home sometime because you really can tell if you've really heard another person's argument by whether you can give it, and it can be harder than you think. So
which is hard to do sometimes.
Yeah, especially if you really disagree with it.
Okay, so I'm going to give my argument, and you know, I said that gay marriage would lead to gender confusion, and now I have proof. No, in all seriousness, my argument is not really about gay marriage, but about marriage and what that is and why we have it and what it's supposed to do in society. And one of the interesting things about marriage is that it's a human universal. And there aren't very many of those, things that we find in culture after culture and time after time. And certainly we find it in many different forms. But it seems that wherever we find it, what marriage does is it responds to three fundamental truths. One is that sex makes babies, and that relationships between men and women are fraught with this possibility and with this responsibility of creating new life. Another is that society needs babies, needs the next generation in order to continue. And a third is that children need mothers and fathers. And when I say that children need mothers and fathers, obviously not in the same sense that they need oxygen, but in the sense that this is the environment in which they tend to do best. You know, when a child is, and it's particularly fathers that I'm concerned about, because when a child is born, usually there's a mother nearby, but fathers don't always stick around. And one of the very important things that marriage does is to encourage this bond between men and women for the sake of the children that they create. And my worry about, my concern with respect to same-sex marriage, most fundamentally is that it's not really marriage we're talking about, because it doesn't bring together men and women in this way. And partly as a result of that, it makes it much harder for us to send this important message in society that children need mothers and fathers. It makes it harder for us to communicate the norms that support that and to sustain those norms. And really, in its worst form, it makes it such that those who try to put forth those traditional norms are labeled as bigots and treated as much as we would treat racists who opposed interracial marriage. So I want to make it very clear that it's not that I'm against gay people, it's not that I'm against love and commitment, it is that there's something very important, marriage, and that is something worth sustaining and sustaining in the traditional way that we know it.
So maybe we should just skip our speeches and open it up for questions.
How did I do?
I'm much better than in New York. You've been practicing.
New York?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I could quibble, but how did I do?
You did well. I was more moved in New York. You had more sort of, you know, I think that you've gotten too used to my talking points now, and so now they're getting boring. I'm talking about my talking points. But what was funny is when we were in New York, while she was giving her presentation of me, she said, I can put this down, she said, well, one of the places where I really agree with Maggie Gallagher, and that got a good laugh. Okay, so now each of us is going to just give you sort of a 15-minute statement of our views, and then, oh, thank you, we'll be ourselves now. Okay. Each of us is going to give a 15-minute statement of our views, and then we're going to question each other for a while, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. And I want to start, once again, by thanking Maggie for being here, because we made great efforts to invite a wide spectrum of people tonight, but of course this is my home university. But it was very gratifying to me that Maggie was willing to participate in this. And I'm pleased to have Maggie here, not just as my co-author, not just as a debate opponent, but as a friend. And people will often say to me, how can you call Maggie Gallagher your friend? I mean, how can you, as a gay rights advocate, spend time hanging around with and being in a friendship with someone actively fighting against equal marriage rights? And the answer to that question is very simple. I drink. A lot. You have no idea. No. The answer to that question is complex. I want to talk a little bit about the answer to that question, because there is a sort of strategic aspect to it, but there's also a personal aspect to it. In terms of the strategic aspect, I want to win this. I want to win this for my sake as a gay man in a relationship, but even more importantly, I want to win it for the sake of all those people who come after me, and particularly the young people out there who are gay or lesbian who ought to be able to aspire to happily ever after in marriage. And I recognize that while we've been making real progress on this issue, we are not there yet. If you look at polls, Gallup polls and so on, it seems that about half the country is on board with marriage rights for same-sex couples, but that also means that about half the country isn't. And so far, in every single state where this has been on the ballot, my side has lost. Now, I'd like to see that change in November. In November, there are 4 states that have this on the ballot: Maryland, Maine, Minnesota, and Washington State. Maryland, Maine, Minnesota, and Washington State. And in 3 of those states, Maryland, Washington State, and Maine, if the voters could actually make it such that after the election we have marriage equality. Minnesota is a traditional marriage amendment, much like the one we have here in Michigan, although it just focuses on marriage, not on civil unions. But we've lost many of those ballot initiatives. We've lost, ultimately in every state so far. And I'd like that to change. And I recognize that if I want that to change, I have to reach out and engage people who disagree with me about this. So when I was invited to do the book, I wanted to go to someone who I thought was going to be a strong and articulate spokesperson for that half of the country that disagreed with me, and so I reached out to Maggie, hoping that through this conversation, by getting the arguments out there, by putting forth our reasons in a public way and having people discuss them, we could actually make progress on this issue, and that ultimately, that equality would win. But there's a personal aspect to it as well, which is that, frankly, sometimes you just click with certain people. And if there's one thing that I ought to understand as a gay person, it's that personal affection doesn't always line up with societal expectation. That is, just because society expects you to click with somebody in a certain way, for example, the way they expect me to click with women and I don't, it doesn't mean you're going to click with those people. And in a similar way, just because people expect you not to click with someone, they expect me to hate Maggie Gallagher, or to get angry at Maggie Gallagher, or to go crazy being around her, and so on, it doesn't mean that that's going to happen either. Maggie and I get along, and I think one of the reasons we get along, one of the important reasons we get along, is that we both care about marriage. And we both care about having a thoughtful dialogue about marriage and moving this forward on the basis of a thoughtful dialogue as opposed to an ugly battle. And it does get ugly sometimes, and it gets unfortunately so sometimes. So let me put forth my positive case in a nutshell in a very simple way. And you can boil it down to sort of 3 things. This is not a syllogism, but there's 3 fundamental points on which I want to rest this. 1, relationships are good for people. 2, marriage is good for relationships. And 3, some of our fellow citizens are gay. So relationships are good for people. Not just because they make us feel good, although happily ever after is part of it, but having someone to come home to at night, to wake up with in the morning, to share life's joys and sorrows with, this is a positive thing in human life. This is something that we celebrate everywhere from great literature to music to trashy television shows. Having that special someone. Because that kind of love, that kind of commitment is good for people. It gets us outside of ourselves. Ultimately, it can help us grow and make us better people. Doesn't mean that it's right for everyone. I don't think that everyone needs to get married. But I do think that for people who want that, that can be a very positive thing in their lives and in the lives of the people around them. Because happy, stable couples make for happy, stable neighbors. But those kinds of relationships are challenging to sustain for the long haul. And so we have marriage, which is good for relationships. It's good for relationships because commitment is good for relationships, but it's also good for relationships because of the web of legal and social rights and responsibilities and expectations that it surrounds the relationship with. Legally, what marriage does is it establishes you as family in the eyes of the law. And then during those important times of life, very often during the for worse times of the for better or for worse, that can become crucial. That can become actually vital in certain ways. So that if one person is in the hospital, the other person can visit or make decisions in the event of incapacity. If one person dies, the other one can get bereavement leave and make funeral decisions. If one person is the breadwinner, the other person can then get Social Security benefits. If one person is a foreigner, the other person can help get residency status for that person. May not seem like a big deal to you unless you happen to fall in love with someone who's not an American citizen. If one person is in legal trouble, the other person cannot be forced to testify against that person. May not seem like a big deal to you unless you happen to be dating a criminal. But it surrounds the relationship with a zone of privacy that straight people take for granted and gay people cannot expect from the government. And if the couple splits up, as couples sometimes do, there's a system of laws in place to help that go more smoothly. A lot of people don't think about this, but one of the important reasons for gay marriage is gay divorce. That is, that there's no system of laws in place for what to do when we've merged our lives and we've merged our property together and now we're taking that apart. And I know there are some lawyers in the audience who might have something to say about that because it's a complicated issue. So marriage surrounds the relationship with all of these legal tools to help sustain the relationship, help create next of kin, make it go more smoothly, make it understood as family in the eyes of the law. But it's not just about this set of legal benefits. It's also about social expectation and social support. When you stand in front of your family and friends and commit to someone for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part, that's valuable. And when your family and friends hold you to that, when they stand behind that and say, okay, we're going to surround you now with certain expectations, rights, and responsibilities because of that, that again helps to sustain the relationship. And once again, that's not just good for the two of you, it's also good for the people around you. Because when there's someone whose job it is to take care of you and vice versa for life, that means the state is less likely to have to do that. So there's a social interest here as well. So I think of it as kind of a win-win situation. Good for the couple, but also good for the people around them, because happy, stable couples make for happy, stable, productive citizens. Okay, so why are people so opposed to this, or why are about half of Americans? There are a lot of arguments we hear, and we'll hear some of them tonight. I just want to mention a few of them real quickly before I hand the floor over to Maggie. One of them has to do with religion. You know, God says that marriage is this way. I want to be very clear that what we're talking about tonight is civil marriage, something that the state does, which is different from religious marriage, something that your church or other religious institution does. Here in the United States, it's hard for people sometimes to separate these things in their minds because we call them both by the same name, marriage. And if you want both, people typically do them at the same time. They fill out the relevant paperwork at City Hall, and then they go before a minister, and as long as they file the paperwork afterwards, they are married both in the eyes of the state and in the eyes of that religious institution. Not every culture does it this way. My in-laws had 2 weddings in the Philippines, one in a Catholic church, one a month later in a courthouse. I want to make it very clear that what the state does about marriage will not force your religion to make any changes to its marriage policy any more than it can tell your religion what kind of baptisms it must perform, or bar mitzvahs it must perform, or any other religious sacrament that it must perform. So that if your religious denomination opposes same-sex marriage, it can continue to do that, and no one is going to force it to perform a wedding that it doesn't want to do. So then people come forth with secular arguments, and a lot of those have to do with the notion that this is a threat to traditional marriage. Now, I hear people make this claim a lot, but I rarely hear people flesh out what it really means. I mean, it's not as if we think that if we support gay people in their relationships, straight people will stop having straight relationships and all go gay. The usual response to a gay person is not, hey, no fair. How come he gets to be gay? Do we think that straight people are just going to give up on the institution of marriage? I mean, what is that dinner conversation going to look like? Well, Jane, I wanted to marry you, but now the guys next door are getting married, so forget it. There is enough love and commitment to go around, so it's not clear to me how supporting same-sex couples, how this would threaten gay relationships, threaten traditional heterosexual marriage. Well, some people say, well, if we allow same-sex marriage, why not polygamy? Why not incest? Why not bestiality? This whole slippery slope down to all of these other things. And it's interesting to me. Polygamy can be heterosexual or homosexual. In fact, the societies that tend to practice it, and it's very common throughout history actually, tend to be among the least accepting of gay relationships. Incest can be heterosexual or homosexual. Bestiality, I suppose, can be heterosexual or homosexual. I prefer not to think about it that carefully. So what does one thing have to do with the other? And people say, well, if you make one change to marriage, why not make any other change to marriage? To which my response is, because each one must be judged on its own merits. Whether it's a good idea to allow people to marry one unrelated person of the same sex is a separate question from whether it's a good idea to allow them to marry their relatives or multiple partners or their pets or so on. And frankly, I think that the slippery slope argument largely changes the question. It actually distracts us from the issue at hand. All right, but what about the needs of children? This is a claim we often hear in the debate, and actually much of Maggie's portion of the book has to do with children's needs and this notion that children need a mother and father, therefore we should not allow same-sex marriage, and there are some steps in between there, although I don't think that they get filled in as clearly as they might. In some ways, I think this is the worst kind of argument because it proceeds from what is not true to what does not follow. So, what is not true? Children need a mother and father. Okay, so obviously many children do well in single-parent households, in same-sex households, in a variety of different family forms. So there's no sense that they need a mother and father. So the more plausible, weaker version of the claim is that that is the ideal situation for children, for them to be with their own biological mother and father in a low-conflict relationship, various other provisos you might add to that. Now, Maggie and I will disagree about what the research says there. But in a way, I think it's irrelevant, or at least to a degree irrelevant, because, and this is the important thing, same-sex couples never take children away from competent heterosexual parents who want them. Same-sex couples never take children away from... It's not as if we're kidnapping children from their own biological mother and father. When gay couples decide to have children, I'm not talking about when they have children from prior relationships, but when they decide to have children, how do they do? We don't wake up and say, oops, we're pregnant. So there are two things that typically happen. One is adoption. That's not where we're taking children from their own biological mother and father, but we're taking children usually from the foster care system and providing them with a loving home. This is positive. This is a good thing. The other, of course, has to do with artificial technologies, artificial insemination, surrogacy, and so on. Now, there's a lot of a big debate that goes on around the moral questions raised by those technologies. But the thing is, you do not have to be married to use them. So it's not at all clear to me how allowing same-sex couples to marry means that fewer children will get to be in this ideal situation of their own mother and father. I mean, think about this. Prohibiting same-sex marriage does not cause lesbians to go marry their sperm donors and form traditional families. I don't mean to be glib about this, but it's not as if the alternative is either this child is going to exist with their own biological mother and father or with this gay couple. Those are not the options on the table. What prohibiting same-sex marriage does end up doing is it means that all of those children, and I think there are about 250,000 of them in the US, who are actually being raised by same-sex couples, do not, in many states, in most states actually, get the benefit of marriage. So if your concern is really about child welfare, if it's really about the welfare of children, it seems you'd want to encourage marriage. You'd want to encourage this kind of stability for those families, as well as for heterosexual families. Okay, so finally, when people move away from the children argument and the slippery slope argument, they often then move to an argument having to do with complementarity, male and female coming together to complete each other, to complement each other. When I look at this argument, I find it somewhat abstract. Because it occurs to me that people complement each other, they complete each other in a variety of ways. I know, for example, that I can get very moody and cranky sometimes, and my partner is more even-keeled, and that helps. That helps not just me, that helps the people around me who get a less cranky version of me thanks to him. It's a good thing. But some people think that now without the male and female thing, you don't have that fundamental complementarity. And I say, what are you talking about? And sometimes they've actually said to me, plumbing. Plumbing? Yes, plumbing. The parts don't fit. And when people tell me that the parts don't fit, I have a very simple response. Yes, they do. Because if they didn't, people would try it, it wouldn't work, and they'd do something else. I mean, I would actually have people say, well, it's obvious that same-sex marriage is wrong because... And I want to say, if you're doing it this way, you're doing it wrong. What do you want me to say? At this point, we don't have an argument anymore. What we have is a panic. And I think we can do a lot better than that. And again, I appreciate the fact that Maggie is here and that you are here for us to have this conversation, because I think tonight is an opportunity for us to do better. So, thank you.
I'm going to sit for this because I don't have a pocket to put this in. So, and
More
also,
gender norms.
So thank you, John. Thanks for having me here. Thanks all of you for being here. John's a lot funnier than I am. What I'd like to do is really tonight is just share with you the story of why I do what I do, including coming here, founding a national organization to fight the political fights over same-sex marriage. The story for me goes back to when I was at Yale. I'm class of '82 at Yale. And I was a pro-life atheist at the time. I'm a practicing Roman Catholic now. But it was the middle of the sexual revolution. And I got pregnant my senior year. That was my oldest son. My boyfriend was a fellow Yale student. When my son was 3, he called me up on the phone and said, I can't do this anymore. I'm just going to have nothing to do with you guys. And I found that puzzling because, frankly, he wasn't doing very much at all. But that was 1986, and neither I nor my son have seen him since. I do hear he's a surgeon in New Hampshire now. And my son has a half-brother that he's never met. So this was quite striking to me because I was educated over and over again with the idea that we have separated sex from reproduction. And I was a pretty smart girl, but it was only after I actually had a baby that it occurred to me. And I got interested in the marriage debate of that time. The marriage debate of that time had nothing to do with gay people. It was about our rapidly rising rates of divorce and unmarried childbearing, and whether these were good things or problems. And when I started in that original marriage debate, if you said marriage really matters because kids need a mom and a dad, people said you were a religious zealot who hated single mothers. But for me, and as I said, I went to a lot of conferences with very smart people, with PhDs, major scholars, and this line would come up again and again. We have separated sex from reproduction. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, but somehow the girls keep getting pregnant, right? The girls and young women keep getting pregnant. And we don't seem to filter this back into our elite discussion or ideology. We have a marriage and family and sexual system that assumes something that is visibly untrue, which is that we have somehow managed to make sex separated from reproduction. Instead, while any given sexual act is very unlikely, if you use contraceptives, to result in a birth, over time, it turns out to be the norm. I mean, I was, being a Yale girl, I went and I started to, I started to look into the data on what contraceptive effectiveness means, and if you use a contraceptive that's 95% effective, in over 10 years, 40% of the women using that will experience a pregnancy. And this explains why, in spite of the fact that we have separated sex and reproduction, that even today, 3/4 of all births are unintended at the time of conception by at least one of their parents. Okay, so it occurred to me personally, and then, so that's step one. I was like, I was really smart. Why did no one ever tell me that, that this is not true? Every time you engage, if you're heterosexual, in a sexual relationship, there's this incredible possibility, which is that you could be creating not only a life, but your child's life. And the second thing, the context, my experience as an unwed mother, a very privileged unwed mother. I had a Yale degree. My parents were very fluent, and they were very supportive of me. They didn't understand why I didn't believe in abortion, but if I was going to have a baby, they were going to help me. And but I learned very quickly that the story that was being told in the 80s by all the people in the white jackets, the smart people, about how great it is that we have so many fatherless children and how liberating it is for women, and that it's only our backward social stigmas, and we're too influenced by television shows from the 1950s. And I learned that it wasn't true. I learned it wasn't true in my own life because I watched and I saw that there are all kinds of things that I was given that I could not give to my son. And I saw it was really hard on me. I was very privileged as an unwed mother, but it was extremely difficult. And I saw, moreover, that while we were celebrating the decline of marriage as a release from social norms, the social science evidence was increasingly showing that what I could see in my own life was true in the lives of millions of other American children. I did a book called The Case for Marriage with a major family scholar, Linda Waite. Came out in the year 2000. Wasn't thinking at all about gay marriage then, but we took a look at the social science evidence and concluded that basically in every way that social scientists know how to measure, bad things happen to children more often when their parents don't get and stay married. Higher rates of crime, delinquency, more school failure, more suicide, higher rates of depression, much more poverty. The list really goes on and on. Now, the majority of children raised by single mothers, like my son, grow up to be wonderful human beings. People can surmount all kinds of more difficult problems. But it's a lot harder, through no fault of their own, when their mom and dad aren't able to forge a basic, decent, good enough marriage in which to raise and to shelter that child and protect that child. And so I spent about 20 years going around the country participating in this debate on marriage. And the simple thing that I was doing, it comes out of my personal experience and my reading of the scientific evidence and my concern that we are in a big marriage crisis, which I think we're still in. It's not a crisis about how much people want soulmates. That idea of marriage is doing fine. But it's a crisis about how serious we are as a society, how committed we are to the idea that marriage really matters because children need their mom and dad, and that adults have a pretty strong obligation to make sacrifices if necessary to get this good for their children. So in 2003, along comes same-sex marriage. The court is about, I have avoided the topic of gay marriage. I was participating in a whole marriage movement. We would get together and say, gay marriage, well, we're not going to talk about that because we're going to focus on divorce and unmarried childbearing. Then all of a sudden we woke up and the courts in Massachusetts this was no longer theoretical. It's coming. What do you think about this? And as a person who was focused on marriage, I thought very hard about it. And I concluded that if we move to same-sex marriage, if the law recognizes two men as a marriage, it's a pretty definitive rejection of the idea that we are, as a society, going to recommit to strengthening marriage and its role in bringing together mothers and fathers for children. After same-sex marriage, I can go to Massachusetts and say marriage really matters because kids need a mom and a dad. And people will look at me and say, well, wait a minute, that's not what marriage is about. The law is clearly contradicting you. If John and his partner are in marriage, then marriage is clearly about something else than getting moms and dads for children. So I'm going to do a short version, since John already gave you the version. This is another version of my talk, but really, the peculiarity of what I think about gay marriage is that it really doesn't have a lot to do with gay people. I don't think anything that a gay couple is doing in their home is going to affect my marriage. But I think the public meaning of marriage, our public understanding of it, does matter. And I think that marriage, not only in this society, but in virtually every known human society, emerges again and again because there's a need for a social institution powerful enough, rich enough with meaning, to actually influence the way young people in the middle of their erotic and romantic and psychological dramas behave. Marriage regulates not only the people who are married, but marriage is a big public idea, regulates people who are not married too. It tells you when you're committing adultery, only because we have this public idea of marriage. It tells you whether you're having an out-of-wedlock child. Without a public institution of marriage, you couldn't know. And in fact, there's some research that one of the problems for women in cohabitating relationships is they often imagine that they're in a common law marriage and their partner has a totally different view of the relationship. So there aren't that many human universals, as John said, channeling Maggie. And you have to ask yourself why. Why is it that over and over again in these diverse cultures, you see a basic marriage idea with many, many different, there's a lot of wacky stuff if you delve into anthropology around marriage, but it has a basic shape. Marriage is a public union, it's not just a private and personal union. It's a sexual union, it's not some other kind of union. Between male and female, at least one man and one woman, because as John said, polygamy is a very common human variant, especially among small tribal societies, in which the rights and responsibilities of the man and the woman towards each other and towards the children of their union are publicly defined and supported, which means we do not leave it up to the next, we do not abandon the next generation and leave it up to young people in the middle of their dramas to work out on their own what this whole big dimension of human experience means. And as I said, this is not hard to find. Why does this happen over and over again? Because sex makes babies, because society needs babies. Societies that do not figure out how to manage the procreative implications of male-female sexual attraction don't survive to become one of those cultures that get counted by our busy anthropologists. And children ought to have a father as well as a mother. And it is fatherhood that is most at stake because, although we have a big important debate about gender and it's all really important, but I just want to put it to the side because the truth I'm pointing to is really more basic. When a baby is born, there is bound to be a mother somewhere close by, right? If we want fathers to be there for their children and for the mothers of their children, biology alone is not going to take us very far. We need a social institution, a cultural mechanism for attaching fathers to the mother-child bond and for communicating to the next generation that they have to act in ways to get this as a great good, both the young men and the young women, for their children. And, a society where the reason gay marriage is plausible in our society to so many people, in addition to the fact that we have this new problem of how to demonstrate respect and care for gay people in our midst, our friends, our family members, our fellow citizens. But in addition, it's because of the weakening, this strong weakening of our marriage culture and our marriage norms that have produced the problem that I'm principally concerned about addressing, which is that 40% of our babies now are born outside of marriage. And actually the divorce rate has dropped, but so slightly less than half of new marriages, probably about 40% of first marriages end in divorce. What happens? How do we reconcile? Now, I guess to me this is a fairly direct way that gay marriage is going to affect marriage as a social institution. The fundamental idea of same-sex marriage is marriage equality, right? It's the idea that there is no morally relevant difference between same-sex and opposite-sex couples. And if you see any difference, there's something wrong with you. You're like a racist who opposed interracial marriage. Which means that once the law goes and the society and the culture goes to same-sex marriage, it's going to become increasingly hard to focus on as morally relevant to marriage the things that really are distinctive about opposite-sex couples, including the one that I care about most, which is that only unions of husbands and wives can make new life and connect those children to their mother and father. We have children in a lot of other families, and I think that we need to support other families. We need to support all of our children. But this, in my view, is the great historic public purpose of marriage. It's the reason, it's the fundamental reason, I think, why marriage is not only a universal human institution, but why there's something called civil marriage in this society at all. Because otherwise, having a government institution that's dedicated to kind of telling you that you should love in sexual pairs, you know, and puts a good housekeeping seal of approval on your relationship, becomes kind of strange. I mean, frankly, in the Anglo-American tradition, the way we demonstrate how important relationships are is not to surround them with a bunch of legal regulation. There is a reason, in other words, John, why the government is involved in my marriage vow, even though I made it in a Roman Catholic church to my Hindu husband, but is not involved in my priest's vow of celibacy. And it's not because I think one is more sacred than the other, right? It's because that we have, until yesterday, understood that creating and sustaining a working marriage culture is necessary in order to protect children and to transmit the society into the future. We're making a big bet with same-sex marriage that we don't need an institution with this purpose, or that somehow we can continue to say that this is one of the key organizing principles of marriage, and yet two men are also in marriage. I don't think we can do that. I think the underlying logic of same-sex marriage leads us to say we have abandoned this understanding of marriage as a public idea, and we have moved on to an idea of marriage as a framework for expressing love to whoever you love, that you have a right to love whoever you will. And most of the features of marriage, of our marriage tradition, start to become much less intelligible and much less coherent. Why does it have to be a sexual union if it's caretaking and love that we're talking about? Why can't two relatives do it if it doesn't have to be a sexual union, if that's what you choose? Just because someone is married, why can't I marry them? Why do you have to be sexual? Why do we assume sexual exclusivity as the norm in marriage, which, by the way, is supported in state laws in varying ways, but I won't go into that here. I think all of these, the key norm, the one I care about most, is discarded. Same-sex marriage is a decision to discard that as a public norm around marriage. And that most of the other features of marriage, which are intelligible because they're about this good, getting this good, are also going to be called into question in a new way. Particularly since, and I will wrap up here, but it's pretty clear that there are many potential pathways to gay marriage, but the one we're moving towards is the idea that if you do not see gay unions as marriages, you are engaging in a form of discrimination. You are violating our sacred public norms of equality, and your views should be stigmatized and marginalized to the extent that the law can. So we're already seeing, to me, completely incomprehensible consequences. In Illinois, when Illinois passed a marriage equivalent civil union law, Equality Illinois promised that it would not affect religious groups. In fact, they promised it would not affect religious adoption agencies. It turns out they thought it was already illegal to discriminate against gay couples, because the day after the law passed, or within a few weeks, Gay couples were showing up at Catholic Charities and Evangelical Lutheran asking to adopt through these religious agencies. They were turned down, and instead of going to all the other agencies that do gay adoptions, they went to the state and charged these agencies with discrimination. The state agreed, and they are put out of the foster care and adoption business. To me, it makes no sense whatsoever, because the one these are the most vulnerable children of all, right? They have no parents. There's not enough foster care and adoptive parents. We need as many as we possibly can. So putting any adoption agency, whether you agree with their policies, that's capable of recruiting and getting good homes for children makes so little sense. So why did it happen? It happened because the new public norm of equality, which is we are going to treat you like a racist if you disagree, seemed to be the main point, and it trumped the other goals in this case. So I would like to believe John when he says that civil marriage is not going to affect religious marriage, but what I think is happening already is that it's becoming increasingly difficult, and that after gay marriage, after acceptance of the principle of marriage equality, that the traditional understanding of sex, marriage, and relationships is going to be, rather than strengthened in the public square, as I would have, is going to be increasingly difficult and dangerous, and institutions who engage in it are going to have to mute their voices or face legal consequences. So that's my case. My case, John, is that gay marriage is not just letting new people into an existing institution. It requires us to change out one idea of marriage, declare we're done with that, probably say that idea of marriage is bad and discriminatory and should be repressed, and move on to a new vision of marriage as rooted primarily in the needs of adults for companionship and caretaking, to which children are an afterthought, not a core organizing purpose.
So we want to hear from the audience, but what I would suggest is maybe each one of us can do one question to the other and then open it up for questions to make sure, because I want to leave plenty of time for audience.
Yeah, whatever you want to do, John. We can go. Do you want to go straight? We had planned to do question each other, but we can go straight to the audience.
We'll just make it one. We'll make it one question. Okay. So I'm sort of chomping at the bit here. There's so much I want to say, but I wrote a book with Maggie to say, which you can buy in the lobby for $17, I think, and we'll be in the back to sign it afterwards. But you want to make sure, and I heard a lot of what you said, but one of the very important things to you is that mothers, and especially fathers, take responsibility for the children that they create. And I get that, and I believe it. And you also think that the way to do that is a strong marriage culture. And I get that, and I believe in it, because I believe that a culture where we encourage people to commit to each other for keeps, not just to sort of hang out, but to really, this is an important commitment and we're going to hold you to that, helps to achieve that, and it also does other good things, even for people who don't have children. But here's the question I want to focus on. You acknowledge that there are gay people in the world, that they fall in love, that they settle down, that they merge their property, that they care for each other in ways and that long-term caretaking can be challenging. And some of us who do that want to publicly declare that commitment, and many of us, even in states like Michigan, where we cannot legally marry, have had commitment ceremonies where we've done that. I start the book by talking about one of those that I attended. I myself have had one of those. Our family and friends will often come to those and stand behind us, and we'll often do various things to the extent that we can to sort of legally merge our property, and in case something happens, be able to care for the other. We do what workarounds we can, even though it can get very expensive. And in addition to all that, very often our families then start to regard us as transformed in an important way. My mother thinks of Mark as her son-in-law, and it wasn't until we had that ceremony that she started sending us anniversary cards, so the family gets involved as well. In your world, given everything you've just said about marriage, and this is not marriage, how much room is there for that? And to the extent that we allow room for it, and to the extent that we say, yes, you can do that, yes, you can legally try to cobble together something, yes, your family can regard you as in-laws and so on, at what point do we not sort of look back at that and say, looks like marriage? Because that's what a lot of people are thinking. That's what a lot of people who look at those relationships say, which is why I think states like New Hampshire and Connecticut and so on that have gone down the civil union path, after a while say, you know what, we've got these two legal statuses, they look the same on paper, why don't we just have one legal status? So I'm asking you what there's room for in Maggie's world.
Well, my problem with civil unions as a compromise is I think we actually have a really fundamental question that one of the two of us, we have to settle, which is our marriage tradition discriminatory? And civil unions is an attempt to kind of buy, you can't buy the right to discriminate with civil unions. And I think it's one of the reasons that, as you say, there are...
You can't buy the right to discriminate.
I can't buy the right. People on my side, not you personally.
I just don't understand what you mean by that.
Many people on my side would like to see, many people, not necessarily on my side, would like to see a compromise around civil unions. I'm just making the point that to me, it's that underlying question, which I think to sustain a working marriage culture, I have to win. Our marriage culture is not discriminatory because it's oriented around an important purpose in which same-sex and opposite-sex couples are actually differently situated. It's not discrimination to treat different things differently, okay? And so if I could win that debate, then there's your question. What do you do with gay people? And the answer is, in my view, you could easily say, well, here's a small group of people. They're not good candidates for marriage. Why don't we do something for them, right? And the answer, the answer wouldn't be, we have to do exactly what we do for married people. It would be, what is the legal structure that best serves the needs? And I suspect it might be different for lesbians than for gay men, because I think men and women are actually quite different. But what's the best default contract? What can we do? And what bothers me about civil unions is the assertion that these two different kinds of relationships must be treated equally or it's wrong, right? But I'm not at all bothered by the idea of, creating another kind of partnership structure to help gay people if I could win the marriage debate. Now, this is obviously an unlikely scenario. So what exactly would, and then the other thing is that if there were different institutions, they could evolve separately in response to what actually works best as the package of, the only thing that I think I really don't believe that you should have non-biological parents becoming legal parents through the partnership status. I think second parent adoption is a much better way. It respects the reality that there is at least a possible claim from a biological parent. And that also, the reason parenthood is automatically imposed on husband and wife is that you're committing to have sex and have sex only with each other. So there's an assumption that if the child appears in the wife's belly, that the husband is the father, because it's part of the preconditions of what you committed to do. And I've puzzled a little bit about what does that mean for two women. If one of them has a baby, the other one, you get to impose parenthood on your partner. So that doesn't make sense. You ask the thing that I'm most concerned about, it would be about trying to mimic marriage around parenting instead of developing what I think would be more appropriate legal institutions for the reality that no sexual union between two men or two women creates a common child. It doesn't happen. So we shouldn't pretend that it does.
Okay. Do you want to ask me a question?
Oh. No, I like it better when you let me talk.
Of course
I
you
talk the way I know.
do. Of course you do. Well, you don't have to ask me a question. We can ask them to ask me questions.
No, John, what is your actual view on the relationship between sexual fidelity and marriage? Do you think it's intrinsic, or I don't know if you think anything is intrinsic to marriage, or we just get to make up the rules however they work, but...
I think that's another one of your false dichotomies, that either it's intrinsic to marriage or we just get to make up the rules as we go along. I think that because marriage is a social institution, if we just made...
That's not my question. My question is...
About fidelity.
Yes. Do you think this... do you think it's core to marriage, and if so, how would you explain that for 2 men and 2 women? Because I mean, I can explain it really well for a husband and wife, right? If the purpose of marriage is to get mothers and fathers for children, sexual fidelity is actually key. Marriage won't do that. Otherwise, you can still be off creating children in fatherless households.
I think that fidelity is an important marital norm, that is an important part of marriage. But that it doesn't follow from that a relationship that does not have that or does not expect that is not a marriage, because as we know and as you've acknowledged, there have been cultures throughout history where at least quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, men were expected to have mistresses. There are cultures today in the world where men can have wives for a day in order to allow them to have sex outside of what we would actually regard as their genuine marriage or marriages. So that I don't think that fidelity is part of the definition of what a marriage is. I do think it's an important norm. I think it's an important norm for a number of reasons. And I would agree with you, I think you would say this, that there are more reasons for people whose relationships can actually result in children, which is many, but of course not all heterosexual couples. There are heterosexual couples who are sterile, who know themselves to be permanently sterile and so on. So they don't have that reason, but they may very well have reasons that have to do with security, with jealousy, with the potential transmission of disease. I mean, there are a number of different things supporting these norms, but they may end up being different for different couples. And they may be different for lesbians than they are for gay men, than they are for heterosexual couples. Okay. There are 2 microphones. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can in the next 45 minutes or so. So please line up. I'm just going to move this back so it makes it easier for me to see people with the microphone over there.
While you're lining up to ask questions or participate in the discussion, I first ask you to give a round of applause to Maggie Gallagher and John. Now I do want to ask you, please, to make your questions or comments brief. They're the speakers. They got to talk longer than any of you in the audience. But the most important thing is for the person who's at the microphone to look behind you at the line so that you can see that everyone wants to speak. Please try to make these primarily in the form of questions and keep them brief. So I'll shut up right now and keep my own remarks brief.
And we'll try to keep our answers brief as well, because we're going to, at 9:30, we're going to do a hard stop so we can sign books in the lobby and talk more to people. So we'll try to get to as many of these as we can. Okay, we're going to start on the left.
Hi. How do you respond to this argument in favor of gay marriage? In the future, it won't be possible to ban gay marriage because there will be so many people cross-dressing that it won't be possible to tell who's gay or who's straight.
Laughter.
There will be so many people cross-dressing, you say?
That it won't be possible to tell who is gay or who is straight.
It seems that people cross-dress, I can't tell whether they're men or they're women, not whether they're gay or they're straight.
right, we're going to move on to the right.
That really was from the left.
Nobody's asked us that question.
We're not expecting you to line up according to your political position here.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I'm a student here at Wayne State. My question is actually for Maggie. I actually want to move a little bit away from gay marriage and just like to marriage as like an idea, period. You stated a lot of things about how marriage is beneficial to children, like mostly, and like how that's the main reason why we should keep marriage is because statistically and based on research, it supports, it helps children more than non-married couples. But I feel like that idea in itself is kind of elitist and discriminatory because I don't think anyone today can say that this one definition of marriage is marriage. Not marriage, but a family. Like families come in single mothers, single fathers, two mothers, whatever today, you know? And so I feel like why focus your time on trying to like maintain this traditional view of marriage that excludes so many other people in our society and not advocating for perhaps policy or systematic change that supports all types of families so that research into statistics isn't in favor of married couples so that all types of families have equal chance of succeeding just as well.
I don't, and this is again maybe my experience as well as my research. I don't think it's possible for one woman alone to do the same, even if I think I was a pretty good mother, but I wasn't able to give my children what my mother and father working together were able to give me. And I found with my son, at the age of 2, he started to ask where his dad was. He doesn't remember any of this, by the way, but I think there's a pretty strong longing to know and be known by and love and be loved by the man and the woman who made you. And that's a longing that marriage makes possible and nothing else does. So if I thought it was possible to recreate all the benefits of marriage and in other ways, then marriage would not be necessary, and I would say we should get government out of the marriage business. But that's our disagreement. If I thought like you did, I would think like you did.
I think my question is mostly for Professor Corvino. So we tried to set aside this question of reproductive technology, and it would just be wonderful if there were more loving homes for foster children and so forth. That would be fantastic.
Yes.
But in fact, many people are not happy with foster children. They want their own children. So to what extent can we separate this question of reproductive technology, which is one, to me, in my view, is monstrous. They're taking eggs from my kids' sisters, and it's all very good because they pay them the money, and then we can rent a womb with money, right? This is the manifestation of alienation from our own bodies. So to what extent can we separate this question? I agree we could in practice separate it, but as a practical matter, it looks like this reproductive technology question comes up in the case of people who, in these cases, right?
Yeah,
I'm going to ask everyone, I know you're appreciative and clapping both for questions and answers. I just appreciate it if you just hold your applause until the very end.
It wasn't that good of a question.
Not that you didn't deserve it.
It seems that point presupposes that marriage is somehow necessary and or sufficient for the use of reproductive technology. That is, it's not clear to me how letting me marry makes it any more or less likely that I'm going to use that technology, makes it any more or less plausible for me to be doing that. Right now, I could, and it's a horrible way of putting it, right? Rent a womb. I wouldn't, but I could, even though I can't marry. And just because I can marry, it doesn't automatically license me or anybody else to go and do that.
That's right.
It seems that the things are independent already.
That's fair.
Good evening. My name is Robert Cooper. I'm the president of Association for Youth Empowerment. And we have an initiative going called Bridging 8 Mile, where we want to do things similar to this in various communities, having people talk who wouldn't usually talk to each other. My first request is if both of you would take out the comparison of this issue to the issue of race and racism as it was addressed in this country. Because it's one of those things that seems that it's those like the dichotomy. And I know this discrimination is at the heart of the issue, but fundamentally it's very, very different. And that would be one request, because I see a lot of students taking notes, and I can see papers and going out next week, and it's like, wait a minute. But anyways, following that, my question is, since we're talking about family, we're talking about marriage, and it seemed to have come down somehow to an issue about what's going to happen to children. And I don't think that that's really the issue at all. It's more of shifting from what institution are we, of the 5 basic social institutions, which one are we talking about now when we talk about gay marriage? Are we talking about family? It doesn't sound like it. We're talking about economics, possibly, because we're talking about some type of exchange. But it comes down to more or less doing business. And I don't mean to diminish it in that way, but it sounds diminishing, but who has the right to have a contract and have that contract honored by the state, regardless of what you want to do with your business? Because, you know, there's no one going to go around doing ballistics and see if, you know, did they do it this way or did they do it that way? But we'll just say, no, just because you say that you are a man and you want to marry another man, or you're a woman, you want to marry another woman, no. And that's very different to all the stuff that went through in the 60s. And then, you know, Wayne State University set up something that allowed someone like me in the 70s to be here to address that. It's not the same thing.
Okay.
So
let's let our speakers respond.
Well, I agree with you, so maybe I should let John respond.
On the point about it being simply a contract which the government will enforce or not enforce, I mean, it's true that the government isn't the enforcer of contracts, and legally speaking, marriage is very importantly a contract. But I think it's a lot more than that, and I think it does have to do with family. When I was talking earlier about how my parents consider my partner their son-in-law, the fact that my niece has 2 uncles where she would have 1. I mean, all of these are aspects of what marriage is. Maybe not aspects of what the legal incidents of marriage do, but as I said, marriage is more than those legal incidents. On your first point about race, I very much appreciate the fact that race and sexual orientation are different, that these issues are different. But I don't want to go so far as to say that we cannot look to the history of racial discrimination and learn from the history of racial discrimination, because that would suggest that the lessons of that history are only applicable to questions of race, and I think that they're applicable more broadly than that. So I think that while I would agree with you that we have to be careful with that comparison and use it very carefully, I don't want to put it off the table.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
I'm sorry, I wish I could allow this to be more of a dialogue, but we want to give everyone a chance to participate.
Right, this is a question for John. I'm a fellow member of the Wayne faculty, and I'm asking this mainly as an educator. I teach classes in debate, social movements, and controversy, and I certainly by no means believe it's my responsibility to protect students from controversial or uncomfortable ideas. Quite the contrary. I do, however, feel I have a responsibility to protect them from content and material that does violence to their very being, right? That undermines their humanity, which perhaps not all, but certainly many arguments against same-sex marriage do, especially to an 18-year-old who is not yet out and is thinking of coming out. And as a result, I shudder quite a bit when considering how to broach specifically the issue of marriage equality in the college classroom, and I wondered what your thoughts were.
It's a really good question, because I appreciate the fact that you said from the beginning that you don't think it's your job to shield them from controversy. I mean, Look, education is difficult. Education can be confrontational. Education at its best can be kind of uncomfortable because it takes us from someplace we're comfortable with and moves us somewhere else that we haven't experienced. But you're right that when you're talking about social movements, some of what's going on out there, not just on this issue, but on a lot of issues, can be very sensitive for certain students. I teach a contemporary moral issues class, and in that class we talk about issues not just of sexuality, but of race, but of class, but of a number of things that I recognize could trigger some students to some really hurtful feelings. And my view on it is the only way to handle that is to spend a good deal of time at the beginning acknowledging that fact, keeping our ears open, making ourselves available to students who might have that experience or feel that way, and do the best we can to model a more thoughtful civil dialogue.
And fortunately, there's now an excellent book that
there's now an excellent book available in the lobby. But I mean, look, one of the reasons Maggie and I do this is because really, you're right, that some of the dialogue around this is really nasty and hurtful, and I want to do the dialogue in a more productive way.
Thanks.
Thanks.
So I have one quick comment and then one quick question. First of all, my name is Anthony Wagner, and I'm the chair of Pride UM Dearborn, University of Michigan Dearborn's LGBT student group, and I was very disappointed that you guys weren't able to make it out this afternoon. So hopefully you guys would be willing to come back.
We'd love to.
Everyone heard that? Hold them to it. They're coming back to UM Dearborn.
I live here. I mean,
yeah, it's common. So then my question is to Maggie. If your argument that the definitive purpose of marriage is to promote a childbearing relationship, wouldn't it then follow that heterosexual couples incapable of producing a child should have the same marriage restrictions that same-sex couples do applied to them as well?
Well, that goes to the question of how marriage protects children. And in the classic view really is that every time a man and a woman commit to be in a sexually exclusive, faithful, lifelong marriage, you've solved a problem, right? First of all, infertility, I mean, there are people who know they cannot have children, right? But the reality is that you don't know when you're going to have children if you're having sex with a member of the opposite sex. You can't be sure, right? So what I would say is that every union of male and female minimally serves the public purpose. It's not the private. This is not why people get married. It's why we create this whole big civil institution called marriage. They serve that purpose because they will not be creating fatherless children across multiple households. And none of them publicly refute it. We always have in the population of the married, we have people who don't have children. We have people who are in the post-child phase. So there's no message communicated at all. You can without any cost include these couples in the marriage pool, both because you don't really know, and it's not really the government's business to do fertility tests. If you did that, you would be making marriage less effective at protecting children, not more. So you think you might want to do it in the interest of some abstract fairness, but in fact, union of male and female, husband and wife, who can give their child a mother and father, you can include everyone who's a man and a woman in this pool, and that will help protect. The more you get into that pool, the more children will be protected, even if that individual couple never has a child.
One of the things I talk about in the book is the example of an elderly heterosexual couple that I know who got married late in life, and the fact that they can't have children, and yet there are still important reasons for us to endorse that marriage. And I argue in the book that Maggie's attempt to say, well, they're still part of the natural life cycle of marriage, all that means is that we've always acknowledged that marriage has these other important purposes as well, and I just wanted to mention that.
Exactly. Thank you.
This is for Maggie. So heterosexual sex often leads to children, yes. And children do much better in stable family environments than otherwise. Yes. Both of these will continue to be true if we extend marriage to gay people. So every reason we have now for supporting and encouraging marriage between heterosexuals will still exist if we expand marriage to homosexuals. So why isn't why aren't your criticisms of homosexual marriage just a distraction from your very valiant efforts for supporting heterosexual marriages?
This happens over and over again. I say something very specific and meaningful to me, at least, that gets translated into something that makes it impossible. So what I said is that the public purpose of marriage, its key public purpose, its most important, what makes it a necessary social institution, is that you need to bring together male and female to make and raise the next generation so children have a mom and a dad. And that got translated in the version you just said to stability is good for children. So yes, if you don't think you don't think children long for a mother and father, that a good society will have an institution that sustains and supports this as an ideal, then you don't have a good reason to be against same-sex marriage, probably. That's our disagreement. But I can say stability is good for children. John said stability is good for children, and he agrees with you. I mean, I do think stability is good for children, but I don't think, the stability of a solo mother is good for children. Just stability in general. It's good not to move too often if for a child. I mean, just children are creatures of habit, right? So stability is good for children. But that is not the same thing as saying that it's important to the extent that we can, and we can't always, but it's that the man and the woman who make the baby stick around and love each other, and the baby too, which is what I actually said. And I think men and women are different. I think gays and lesbians are therefore different. And I think if you don't think those things matter, then probably you would be for gay marriage. I think they do.
I don't mean to bring up the same point over and over, but in foster care, there are a lot of kids that don't get homes and end up aging out. And those kids that age out there's high rates of crime and homelessness. And so say that a gay man who's in a relationship adopts or houses one of these kids. If he passes away, his partner, chances are, cannot take that kid. So then they end up back in the adoption agency or the foster care facing those same rates of crime and homelessness. In your eyes, homosexuality may be an evil, but don't you think that it's a lesser of the two?
Okay, so let's talk. I didn't actually make a case against gay adoption or foster care because I think they serve different functions than marriage. I think adoption and fostering are both very good things. They're happy endings to a sad and unjust story. I mean, we have adoption and foster care because we have children who don't even have one parent who is able or willing to care for them, and those children need parents. Which is why I think back in the 90s when people said, okay, maybe you don't personally believe in gay adoption, but these children need homes, we got gay adoption well before gay marriage precisely under that argument. And it makes sense to me. I mean, if we're going to have, I think ideally all those children would be with a married mom and dad, but the world is not ideal and those children need homes. So there are single mothers who adopt, there are single fathers who adopt, there are gay people who adopt and foster children, and we should be grateful to every responsible person who's trying to rescue these children. I don't know if a child is placed in a home with two parents, I assume with two adults, that the foster agency approves both of them, right? So I'm not sure that your assumption that if you're fostering one and then a partner dies, that the state would come in and put them in a new foster home. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but it's possible I don't know foster care law well enough to answer.
It is true that here in Michigan, we don't, in any clear way, have second parent adoption. There are a few judges who are willing to do it for same-sex couples, but it's not a standard thing, and so...
Yeah, foster care is not adoption.
Right,
so
but when this couple wants to provide more stability for the child by adopting the child, it is often the case that only one of them can adopt the child, and then if that scenario were to occur, it creates difficulties for the child. If you go before a sympathetic judge, it may work out. It may, if you're not.
Well, as I said, to me, I think second parent adoption, if we're going to have these, that would be the right legal mechanism for and it has a big advantage over partnerships because it's the normal way we transfer parenthood to a non-biological parent. It has protections built in for the potential rights of biological parents, and it is an act of the court, so it will be recognized in all 50 states and actually by international convention all over the world. So, if you're going to want to be a legal parent to a biologically unrelated child, don't mess around with what's fair. Get the strongest legal protection you can, and that's adoption.
Does it strike you at all odd that the state might say, you are good enough to adopt this child, you are good enough to raise this child together, but not to marry?
It's not that you're not good enough to marry, it's that what you want to do is not marriage. That is it. And then before it can become a marriage, it's not an expression or a judgment that your relationship is not good enough. It's that if you view marriage as being in the way that I do and the way we historically have, as having this public purpose. John, you don't want a wife, right? You don't want to take the responsibility for a woman.
And I imagine most would not want
children.
me.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about that, John, but women are funny. So therefore, you want to do something else.
Right. There's more to say, but I want to.
Hi, my name is Josette Heka. My question was also on foster care. I'm bisexual, and one day I hope to be in a relationship with a woman and able to get married and raise a family and be able to adopt children and foster children. Even if I marry a man, I still want to adopt and foster. My view is it doesn't matter if I'm a man or a woman, adopting and fostering does good for everybody. I come from a foster family. My parents are both foster parents. And when you're saying that they should be with a man and a woman, that's like the ideal situation, a married couple, their biological parents. I think of my brothers who were adopted from two people who are addicted to drugs. They're married, they're a man and a woman, and they're addicted to drugs and abuse their children. They're adopted by my parents who are also a man and a woman. But if my brothers were taken out of that situation and put into a situation with two men that would love them and care for them, they would still my brothers have issues about abandonment with being taken away from their parents, as a lot of adopted children do. But it doesn't change the fact that it would have been the same if they were adopted by a man and a man. They're still going to have abandonment issues. They're still going to want to know where they came from. Adoption is just that way. And you've answered most of the questions about you think that they should have both parents be able to adopt a child, but that's just not the case. In a lot of states, if a couple is not married, then only one of the partners can adopt the child and the other one can't. And it just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I would say it would be a lot easier probably to get second parent adoption in all 50 states if that was the main push. Then the pushback on that would be a lot less than you're getting now on marriage. But
you've got people like Brian Fisher at the American Family Association, and
by the way, there are very few states. I think Utah is one of them. Arkansas. There are states where that's true. And I don't know that it makes sense to me. I mean, I guess it does make sense to me for opposite-sex couples, that if you could marry and you choose not to, that's probably a sign that you shouldn't be jointly adopting a child together, right? Anyway, I think the situation, if the state does not recognize same-sex unions as marriages, means different if you're living together and not married, if you're a gay couple. So, I guess I hear the energy. By the way, thank you for speaking up. Thank you for wanting to foster and adopt children. I agree with you 100%. That's a great blessing. As I said, I agree with you. I think we need as many loving parents to help as many of these children as we can. And anyone who's willing to do this and is a good parent should be honored and respected.
Yes, my name is Edward Bibbs. I'm a student at Wayne Community College. And my question is, for the same-sex marriages, how, when you have a child or adopt them, do you insert the morals of a man and a woman, as far as the man leading the woman and the woman being the home provider or being the strength behind the man to make him want to achieve more?
I think that loving couple, I don't think you need to be in a relationship with someone of the opposite sex or someone of a different sex in order for each of you to encourage the other one to want to achieve more. In fact, I think one of the things that I have found valuable about being in a relationship, and I've been with my partner for 11 years now, is that because of him I want to be a better person. Not even just so much in terms of achieving more in my career and so on, but wanting to be more loving, wanting to be more caring, wanting to be more dependable and reliable or so on. I mean, I think that relationship does that. And I think that, for some of us who happen to be gay, that when we try to get that with someone of the other sex, it usually doesn't work out very well. And that's, and sometimes we don't figure that out until after we marry some of the other sex, and that can be very difficult for both people involved. So I agree with you that relationship does that, but not necessarily. It doesn't have to be heterosexual relationship.
My name is Robert Wilbur. I'm a graduate student here at Wayne State in philosophy. Let me make sure, Maggie, that I understand what you're saying first. I don't want to ask you a question about something you didn't say. You support heterosexual marriage as the best means to create and promote the creation of nuclear families. Is that correct? Okay. With 7 billion people on Earth and countless thousands, not just abroad but here in the U.S., going hungry in the dark, do you really think it's ethical to promote the creation of new children at all?
Yes. A baby's God's opinion that the world should go on. It's funny because the belief, it's not funny, but it's quite striking that educated and intelligent people believe that we can dispense with reproduction as a good. I don't know if your position is that there's already too much of it, and therefore, I guess I have a hard time grasping that position. I will say there are places where there is rampant population growth, but in all of the developed countries now, with the exception of America, which is just barely below replacement level fertility, we are now seeing rates of reproduction which imply a society is going to actually die out. Maybe that's a good thing if there are no more Italians, because Italian women are having on average 1.2 women per children per woman, which means that the population is roughly being cut in half in every generation. So 100 in the first generation, 50 in the second, 25, 12.5, that's one lifespan. You don't really notice it at first because there's so many living, older adults around. You don't really notice that what you have is not a sustainable family culture. But I actually think the societies that are otherwise best for human flourishing have an unrecognized crisis, that people don't care enough, or whatever. They don't seem to know how to get men and women together to make and raise enough children to transmit the society into the future. That's one half of the problem. The other half is the suffering and problems caused by family fragmentation or the failure of men and women to form families together in the first place. But I think it's very ethical. I don't know, he's the gay moralist.
I am the gay moralist. Well, one thing I say in the book is that I wish some of this conversation about children and children's welfare and children's needs could be transformed into a broader conversation about whether and when and why to bring children in the world, including doing it the old-fashioned way. And we don't have that conversation. And it's strange that we don't have that conversation. For all of the moral issues we talk about, you won't find any contemporary moral issues textbook that has an article in it about whether you should bring children into the world. And I find that striking, that we don't, because I think people just sort of go through the motions and do it. And I think sometimes it's wonderful when they do it. I love my nieces, but I also think that it would be worthwhile to step back and think more carefully about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Brian Dukes. I'm from the College of Engineering. My question is mainly for Professor Corvino.
One of my former students.
This is correct. Gonna make you proud. You mentioned in your speech that legalizing gay marriage in the same way traditional marriage, for all the rights and, I guess, to defend all of the privileges that a man and a woman share when they are married, that this would not affect churches or other institutions.
It wouldn't force any of them to perform weddings that they don't want to perform. Maggie has talked about other ways in which she thinks it affects churches, but we can talk about those. So, sorry, go ahead.
Correct. And which I was going to bring up is that Mrs. Gallagher, during her speech, brought up adoption and foster care in Illinois. Just recently in the news, in the last month or so, there was a photographer who did not want to take pictures at a gay wedding, and is now under lawsuit, huge news, saying it's discrimination. In my professional ethics class here on campus, here's where you're going to be proud, I've remembered, is that we talked about discrimination, and we talked about what exactly is discrimination, and also why not. And that you talked about if a private company sees that it's to their benefit to not hire a minority, or to not hire a person with a lower education, or to not hire women because the job is suited for men, or for whatever reason, that company has the right to say if it's in their better interest, if it's in their interest to not hire one person and to hire another, and that's their right. For this photographer and for the adoption agencies, you argue the rights of same-sex attraction, couples who have same-sex attraction to be married. How do you do that without taking away the rights of heterosexuals, especially photographers, adoption agencies, who say, you know what, it's in our best interest to have heterosexual parents as adoption agencies, or photographers say, it's in my best interest from a professional standpoint to put in my portfolio heterosexual marriages because the majority of my customers are heterosexual. Okay, how do you then, so the end question is, how do you defend the rights? How do you promote your rights without taking away the rights of heterosexuals?
Okay, so I think we need to make a distinction here between marriage law and anti-discrimination law.
Right.
And the cases that we've been talking about, like the case in Illinois, was not about marriage law. Illinois doesn't have marriage for same-sex couples. It wasn't even primarily about the civil unions law. It was about an aspect of the civil unions law that specifically had to do with discrimination. It came as part of an overall package, yes, but those are separable in principle. Now, I personally believe, and you may remember some of this from class, although there are different, as we talked about in class, there are differences about how to handle discrimination when companies think it's in their interest to discriminate. I think that there are difficult questions about how we balance this in society. On the one hand, people's right to live in a community and flourish. On the other hand, people's right to not recognize certain unions, hire certain employees, what have you, that they don't want to recognize. But what are the limits here? And I think it's important to recognize that we already have this problem in a way that has nothing to do with gay people. I mean, I might not believe in divorce and remarriage, but I still have to treat Newt Gingrich and his third wife as married. I might think that Mormonism is a cult, but I still have to treat the Romneys as married. Yeah. I might think that there should be a moratorium on Kardashian weddings. I would be right about it. The point is that all of us legally have to recognize marriages that personally we may disapprove of. And to the extent that the state says, well, the photography case is a case where I've said in public forums, and I'll say it here again today, I don't think any photographer should be forced to take a picture they don't want to take, because I think photography is a form of self-expression, and I'm a big free speech guy, and why would I want someone taking pictures of my wedding if they disapprove anyway? But again, what are the limits? If I don't want to take pictures of a Mormon wedding, if I don't want to take pictures of bar mitzvah because I'm against Jewish people, to the extent that I'm participating in business with all the rights and responsibilities and so on that go with participating in the public realm of business, at some point we have to balance those, the needs of that community with my individual rights? And that's a hard question, but it's not a question that needs to be pinned on the issue of same-sex marriage. And I should add, I just released a series of 9 YouTube videos on issues in the marriage debate, and one of them was specifically on religious freedom. So I'd encourage you to go on YouTube and look at those. You can find them on my website at johncorvino.com.
And it's just like a accident of an enormous coincidence that every time we have either gay marriage or marriage equivalent law, civil unions, that suddenly Catholic Charities has to go out of the adoption. It has nothing to do with it.
It's not an enormous coincidence. It is true that these things often start to be pushed as a package, but it's also true that the things that coming from your side tend to be pushed as a package, and I can make distinctions, legitimate philosophical distinctions between those things, while still acknowledging that in the political sphere, as we experience it now, some of these questions become very difficult. But again, none of these questions about discrimination are specific to the gay marriage question.
No, I disagree, but he asked you, not me.
Hello, my name's Jennifer. I'm a student here at Wayne, and my question actually is for Ms. Gallagher. It seems like your argument rests on the definition of marriage, which I'm a little bit, clearly you're saying it has to do with, making babies and protecting the babies. I'm a little unclear about your response to the question about overpopulation. It sounded like you're kind of arguing for racial purity for Italians or something. I didn't really get it. But in any case...
I'm in an interracial marriage, just full disclosure. I don't know what you heard as racist.
I know, I didn't understand. I'm unclear.
Okay.
But if your argument is to say that marriage between a man and a woman protects children, then I was wondering how so specifically, because in fact, from my own experience, I could say that husbands leave. And I don't think that our, gay neighbors having been married would have made one difference as to whether or not he would leave. And not only that, you haven't said anything that convinces me otherwise. In fact, it can be argued that what failed was the Catholic Church in training him to properly be a husband or to stay with his children, because he was raised Catholic, and I myself am Roman Catholic, so I love the Church. But I can say that what's been happening so far isn't working. And instead of trying to hold tight to this way we want to define marriage, as being between a man and a woman, I don't understand why we don't adjust our definition to something that works. So my question to you is, how specifically can you say that this will disintegrate marriage and will hurt children, allowing marriage equality and legal marriage for gay people? How is this going to be a problem for children? And how is that going to make a difference when your way has already failed?
Since I already explained this, and what I find when I explain it is half the room gets it, and they agree with me, and the other half that disagrees with me can't follow it. So I'm struggling here. I mean, you said a number of things. Somehow, I don't know what the definition of marriage that's going to solve the problem that husbands are abandoning families, or if there's a definition of marriage that would make that not a problem anymore. There was a lot of emotion packed around that I wanted to acknowledge, but I don't really know.
Well, injustice makes me upset.
What?
Injustice makes me upset.
Injustice needs to be what?
Injustice makes me upset.
All right. And I don't think our marriage tradition is unjust, as I said. I think that it reflects, captures, and communicates an important truth about the way same-sex and opposite-sex couples are different. And obviously, I've failed to persuade you of that. But it is what I believe.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see that we have 10 people left in line, so they'll be the last 10 people. And we're going to try to do so, because we have less than 15 minutes, fewer than 15 minutes left. So we're going to try to do what we call lightning round, where questions are very quick and answers are very quick.
John says I flunked this.
We're not always very good at it.
Means me.
So we're going to try. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm going off some information that some notes I'd taken from Maggie's speech. So correct me if I'm wrong on this also. Only unions of male and females can connect the children to the mothers and fathers, and that gay marriage works against the need for the children to form that connection with the mother and father. Why is that so important that a similar connection cannot be made for two fathers or two mothers? And more specifically, what about non-typical gender roles where there may be a man who physically is in a man's body, but everything else, emotionally, psychologically, they identify as a woman? And where's the conflict with that? Why can't a child make a connection with those types of relationships?
Well, I think when children are not with their mother and father, I hope they can make connections with all other kinds of people because they need connections. So I don't know how to respond to that. I think there's a loss for children when the man and the woman who made them don't stick around and love them and raise them in a decent family together. There are losses for society. And in other books I've written, I've kind of documented the evidence for why that's true. So can two men be good fathers to a child? Yeah, I think so. And I think children without fathers can be raised by loving mothers to be good human beings, but not without some loss for the child. And in a society which loses this as a basic norm, I think it's already happening. As we lose this vision of marriage, more and more children suffer the loss, and it becomes harder to rely on stable marriages because they're about satisfying adults' needs and less about making this commitment to children. That's the problem.
Thank you.
I was wondering, Maggie, your statement about the closing of Catholic adoption agencies and how it's terrible. How does an adoption agency closing affect the number of people willing to adopt children? How does it reduce the number of children that can be adopted?
It doesn't reduce the number of children who can be adopted. It means there's one fewer player out there looking for parents for these children. I don't know how active Catholic, I mean, it's kind of natural if you're Catholic, you might want to go to Catholic Charities if you're adopting. I do know we did an interview it's up on the marriage MADA.org, which is one of the websites, with a whole cluster of families who adopted children through Evangelical Lutheran. And she says very clearly that if it, one was the forager. She wanted to go to an evangelical adoption agency who helped her through the foster to adopt process. And then she got a whole bunch of circle of her friends within her church to also adopt, and sibling groups really. And it's a kind of lovely story. And she is extremely sad about the shutdown of this agency, but she says she doesn't think she would have entered the system if Evangelical Lutheran wasn't there. She wouldn't, maybe she would have found another way. But in the same way that I would have said, well, we don't want to prevent gay couples from adopting, even if I don't think it's ideal, because we need parents. These are children, we just need as many parents as we can. I don't really understand why the gay rights movement, or at least some elements of it, activists within it, decided it was more important to publicly express the norm that you can't refuse to do gay adoptions than to have as many competent adoption agencies seeking homes for these families as possible. There are definitely gay people who would agree with me on that, but it's still the underlying logic of this drive to treat the traditional understanding of sex and marriage as the equivalent of racism in the public square does seem to be driving to these consequences, and I think it's going to continue to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for coming out this evening and doing this. Appreciate this. My question is for Dr. Corvino. I agree with, I think from what you're saying, is with marriage being an institution which two people can have a companionship and share each other's life. You might probably would say love each other, give each other in a very deep and intimate way. But I would say, what would you say then to a position that I would certainly would uphold, is that when you're talking about like traditional marriage of man and women, when they come together, it's the fact that they have at least the possibility, at least ideally, of having that child. And that child, which is the product of a sexual union, which is a real expression of that deep love for each other. Whether you're religious or not, could you not see like you could say, well, the human beings have a way of natural law or whatever it is, the way we're created. There's a way in which we learn from how we're made. Like, we grow slowly as human beings because we're so complex as compared to regular, other animals, which, like that. When you look at the child being the product of that sexual union between a man and a woman, and the man and the woman having to learn how to give more of themselves as the result of that child coming into their life, even more so than they were when they were just man and woman together in that marriage. What do you say to that as a way of saying, yeah, man and woman marriage is something different than what people are arguing for gay marriage?
I'd say yes. No. I believe in lightning round, not that much. No, I'd say yes, there is something wonderful and special and beautiful and awe-inspiring about that. I've never been a kid person. It's like people ask me if I want kids, and I say, to rake the leaves, yeah. But no. So I'd never considered myself a kid person. And then 2 years ago, my sister and my partner's sister, within 3 weeks of each other, both had kids. And, there's something just joyous about kids and just the way they are, right? Babies are, there's just something delightful about them. They're cute, they're innocent, it's beautiful. But there was also something to me sort of awe-inspiring about the fact that this baby emerged from my sister, and that my partner's niece emerged from his sister. There's something beautiful and special about that. It does not follow that those are the only kinds of beautiful and worthwhile relationship. It does not follow that couples who adopt, including same-sex couples who adopt, doesn't follow that they don't have real families, or that they don't need the support and protection and rights and responsibilities of marriage. And it does not follow that those of us who are childless and remain childless cannot benefit from the support and stability and rights and responsibilities of marriage. So I think, and I want to say, and I say it in the book and I'll say it right here, there's something awesome about the fact that a loving relationship between two people can also create new life. Yeah, that's really special. But it's not the only good thing that marriage does.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is for Ms. Gallagher. First, I want to thank you for sharing your personal experience with everyone. I'm sure that is I profoundly respect what you did as a single parent. But you did acknowledge your privilege in terms of resources and support. So in a circumstance where an unplanned pregnancy would happen and that support and resources were not available, and because you're pro-life, obviously abortion's not an option, and adoption came, and that happened. Why do you believe that the child is not deserving of the protection that you believe the institution of marriage gives the parents who are then committed to sticking it out for the long haul as parents of that child?
The way marriage, from my reading of the social science literature, the way marriage protects children is fundamentally to the extent that it keeps the man and the woman who made the child together in one family, which is to say, children who live with remarried mothers do not do better than children who live with solo mothers on average. So it's not just that we have some legal benefits, et cetera, that help the adults in their partnership, and this provides stability that comes down to the child. If that were true, then children would be better off if they're living with remarried mothers than with solo mothers, and they're not. So I don't actually think that marriage is going to be very important for protecting the children of gay couples. As I said, I think second parent adoption seems to me more on point if that's your real concern.
I'm sorry.
I also think the number of children who are going to be affected is infinitesimal. 80% of children with a gay parent seem to be the product of previous heterosexual relationships, according to Gary Gates, who's the leading demographer of gay people and a gay man. It's an estimate, we don't know for sure, but the image that we have, at least, so it's very few, only a fraction of gay people in coupled relationships enter marriages, and they have very high rates of dissolution in places, the least homophobic places on the planet. So, which feeds my idea that I actually think there's something about marriage and its norms which arises out of the experience of trying to deal with opposite-sex couples, and it doesn't fit that well with gay people in their lives. except for this new moral norm of equality, which people feel very passionately attached to. So I don't think marriage is going to be particularly important in protecting these children.
What would?
We have
second parent adoption.
Discussion
Okay.
on
2 minutes.
You can continue the conversation when you buy a book.
I want to say you don't have to buy the book to continue the conversation, but we did say that we would do a hard stop at 9:30, so I think that this may have to be the last question. But the people who are still in line get to cut the line and come talk to us first in the back, because I want to respect everybody's time, and also we've only rented the room until a certain time. So, last question.
Hello, my question is most relevant to Maggie Gallagher's argument. Much of your argument seemed to place stress on the importance of procreation and childbearing as a purpose of marriage. However, we see increasingly that many married couples are decidedly anti-childbearing and even decidedly celibate. And yet, there are still other benefits to marriage, including governmental tax benefits, insurance benefits, post-death benefits, and more. And since there are benefits that are being extended to heterosexual couples that are being denied to homosexual couples, how is this a system that's not discriminatory to the benefit of heterosexuals and to the detriment of homosexuals?
I think the idea that there are really important big legal benefits that feel like a check when you get married, I would just say this not so much to the gay people, but to the straight people who may be thinking about marriage. I think it's been really oversold as part of the argument for gay marriage. You can lose your health insurance because you get married. You can increase your tax rates because you get married. It doesn't actually, in a uniform way, increase legal benefits. What the law does is it treats you as a unit, and it does that whether it helps you or whether it hurts you. So the purpose of marriage law is not to shower benefits on heterosexuals, but to create a unit that is treated like a unit by government and society. So I just want to say that. Partly because I don't think about marriage as giving a check to heterosexuals that's being denied to homosexuals. And I don't think that's it's not for me a very motivating argument. But I would turn it around and say, pretty sure that if I said, okay, you can have every single one of those benefits, but I want to be able to keep the idea that marriage is the union of husband and wife for a reason, because the ideal for a child is a mother and father. Would you say, okay, that's fair then? Or would you say, no, that's not fair because it's unequal and discriminatory?
Okay. I wanted to give John a chance to rebut, but I'm not going to. It's 9:30, hard deadline, and he will no doubt